Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Chris Baker, Ajahn Pasuri, the Deputy Dean of International Affairs, Ajahn Prae, the Director of the Center for Translation, colleagues, friends. It is a great honor for me to be here today to introduce our esteemed speaker, the recipient of the honorary doctoral degree in history from the Faculty of Arts,ฬาลงกรณ์ University, Dr. Chris Baker. Of course, Ajahn Chris, as we like to call him, needs no introduction. And you wouldn't all come all the way here today if you hadn't already known how awesome he is. In fact, everyone knows that Ajahn Chris should have been awarded this degree ages ago. I feel most fortunate to actually be the chairperson of the history department who nominated him at long last. Although I must be honest that the decision was unanimous among my colleagues in the history department. In preparation for the lecture today, I told Ajahn Chris that his nomination was met with great enthusiasm and support from many other departments and centers within the Faculty of Arts,ฬาลงกรณ์ University. Aside from the great works he has done in the field of Thai history, from Ayutthaya to the contemporary, Ajahn Chris is also known for his collaboration with Ajahn Phasuk Phongphaichit in translating some of the most important works in classical Thai literature, with masterpieces like the likes of Khun Chang Khun Pan and Yuan Pai. The Thai department, the Center for Translation Studies, Linguistics, Comparative Literature, actually, all literature specialists of every language in this faculty have been looking forward to Ajahn Chris' lecture today for quite some time. No pressure at all, really. So it does sound like quite a tall order, but Ajahn Chris, as always, has tackled it head on, sending me the title of his lecture months ago, History and Literature and History. So there would definitely be a little something for everyone in this. But do keep in mind that we historians are hosting the event today. So it's history and literature and history, and not literature and history and literature. Anyway, today, aside from the spectacular talk that we will hear from Ajahn Chris in a moment, after his talk, there would be a chance for us all to join in discussion, questions, Q&A, and Silkworm Books has also been very kind to give a special 20% off on all Ajahn Chris and Ajahn Phasuk's Thai literature titles, except for the newest, most recent, Nirāt Hari Punchai will be 10% off. So the QR code for the purchase would be on the registration table on your way out. So if you haven't purchased already 10 copies of each, do so before leaving today. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Ajahn Chris. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to Ajahn Wasana for that introduction. And thank you ever so much to the faculty for giving me this honorary degree last year. I'm exceptionally proud of this. You know, I withdrew, as it were, from formal academia over 40 years ago. And as a result of doing that, you miss out on getting all those little prizes and awards and so on, you know, with promotions and so on. So to get this was really very, very special to me, probably much more special than giving it to an average professor who's got 6 or 7 of these already. So to me, it was wonderful. As Ajahn Wasana says, I will talk somewhere between history and literature today. And of course, I made up this title that you see here, because at the time I wasn't quite sure what I was going to talk about, but I am a bit more sure today. So this lecture is about Ayutthaya, it's about sources, and it's about humanity. I'm interested in social history, or the history of society. Much of history writing is about power, about kings and battles and government. I'm much more interested in changes in the well-being of humanity. And in researching such history, cultural products such as literature, painting, architecture, music can be very useful. Around 20 years ago, Ajahn Pasuk and I completed a draft of a history of Ayutthaya, but somehow it just didn't click, okay? And we let it lie around for over a decade. And the key to making it click was this book. It was Yuan Pai. Now, Yuan Pai is a royal eulogy or panegyric celebrating King Trilokanath and a war poem focusing on a battle between Siam and Lanna around 1475 CE. Ajahn Patama from this faculty has studied the poem as a panegyric, and Griswold and Presert extracted the information from the poem for constructing the history of kings and battles of power. But there is much more in this poem, which are about people. Existing studies of Yuan Pai all call it a poem and assume that it has a single author. But in fact, in Siam, there was no tradition of unique authorship and sacrosanct texts, and none of the old works are signed or dated by an author. Yuan Pai has 6 rather distinct sections, and they're different in style and content, and they don't chain together very smoothly. The second and third, these two here, are both summaries of the historical background to the battle, and they overlap and sometimes contradict each other. It's very difficult to imagine a single author planning such a work. More likely, it's what we would call today an edited book, a collection of articles on the same topic that have been included together within the covers of one Samut Thai. I want to highlight 4 features of this work. The first is about elephants and humans. In the lead-up to the battle, there is a description of the army, and the elephant brigade has 1,000 elephants. Around 60 of them are listed, each with a name, usually in Khmer or Pali, languages of sacredness. Okay, better? Yeah, great, sorry. Okay. In the lead up to the battle, the description of the army, the elephant brigade has 1,000 elephants, and around 60 of them are listed, each with a name, usually in Khmer or Pali, languages of sacredness and power, and a capsule description describing their beauty, their martial talents, their invulnerability, their magic, their record of success in past conflicts, and their fearsomeness, especially when they're in must. Their beauty, Jamrat Jakapan, tusks curved like waxing crescent moons. The finest sight is Jamran Jakapat, both tall and bold like something from a dream. And their skills and their invulnerability. Gao Jakarat is skilled, adept and strong. Banpu Monton, invulnerable to pike and gun. And their fearsomeness. Pet Prain, ferocious beast, leaking oil both sides from cheek to tail. And Mern Monsak, shaped to fill a foe with fear. And their value of the elephants is summed up. Some so superb surpass a city's worth. Ka Kuan Mern, it's a lovely phrase. After this, in the description, there are 500 horses, of which 17 are given names and descriptions, only a little less grand than the elephants. By contrast, the humans in this army are not glorified at all. Only a couple of officers are mentioned by name, and only in passing. None is described. None is praised for their skills or past experience. The text emphasizes only how many people there were and what weapons they were carrying. It says nothing of their worth. Their worth, in a sense, nothing. Right? The prominence to the elephants partly reflects their importance in warfare at this time. Around this time, Ayutthaya started really hunting elephants in big numbers, and the numbers in their stock increased from 500 to 10,000. And this totally changed warfare. It allowed armies to go much farther afield. Before this, Ayutthaya armies had never gone like this. And they were attacked Tavoy, Chiang Mai, and Angkor for the first time. At this point, gunpowder had not yet arrived, and it was elephants that really made the difference in warfare. But this contrast between the descriptions of elephants and humans also reflected the low value accorded to ordinary people at this time. The second point in the poem is about blood and bloodthirstiness. At the climax of the battle, the enemy commander is killed on his elephant, and he is called the Lao, okay? The Lao in flight, head lopped, collapses down. The pikemen cheer the tusker, thrust again! The Lao hangs headless from the tusker's neck. His blood wells up and floods away Chilgan. And after that, there's a massacre. Among dense tamarins, the panicked Lao are knocked down to their tuskers' feet in droves. Amid the din are caught and slashed down dead like row on row of felled banana trees. And it was actually this line that really got me. Martial literature, literature about battles, of course, it's always bloodthirsty and sadistic. But this image of men being slashed down like banana trees, like this, you can imagine this foliage falling down, in row on row, is especially graphic and sadistic. And the comparison to plants is, again, dehumanizing. And the third point is about warfare and society. Once the victory is won, the looting starts. And the poem describes what the enemy has lost and the Ayutthaya forces have won. Their ladies, lustrous skin and bosoms, their weapons, kit in no small measure, their countless bars of gold, and children, right? Their howdahs, gilt, and many tuskers. We tie up prisoners, drag them round by horse. When tired, they're sold away or swapped for booze. The Burmese chronicles report much the same thing. How much loot was carried away from the battlefield. After the Pegu forces came back from Ayutthaya in 1569, there was not a single one in the whole of the 54 brigades who did not obtain 1 or 2 coolie loads of loot in the form of gold, silver, wearing apparel, etc. You get this quite often in the chronicles. So, war is a process of redistribution of goods. And the victors also collected the heads of the slaughtered enemy. They lop off heads, lugged back to give the king. This appears in the Thai chronicles, the Burmese chronicles, the Khmer chronicles too. After one battle, the Thai chronicle claims that 4/5 of the Thai cavalrymen carried heads away from the battlefield. And they did this because they got rewards for turning up to the quartermaster carrying these heads. And these rewards are listed in the old laws, in the Three Seals law, in the Palace law, and in the law on warfare. So it says, anyone who rides a horse to battle and takes a head is rewarded with a golden bowl, cloth, and promotion. And a prize soldier or king's guard, a grunt, a low-level soldier, okay, who takes a lord, in other words, an officer on the other side, is rewarded with good gold, good silver, appointment to eat a city, and a royally presented wife. He goes from near the bottom of this society to very near the top, just like that. Similarly, those who fail on the battlefield are punished. They are killed or they are stripped of their wealth, their wives, and their children. And this crude practice of carrot and stick continues this theme of dehumanization in this period. But it also points to the importance of warfare more widely in Ayutthaya society of this era. Warfare was a major determinant of flows of goods within the society. A victorious ruler gained cash, weapons, women, Buddha images, tributaries, and so on. Successful nobles got higher appointments, and ordinary soldiers gained rewards from the king and loot from the battlefield, including people to be their slaves. Today we think of the economy, right, as a bundle of processes that determine the prosperity, power, and status of different members of the society. Back then, in the 15th and 16th century in Southeast Asia, warfare played a very similar role. And for this reason, in our book in Ayutthaya, we called this an age of warfare. Most likely, this was the time when the prize system was universalized to regiment the society for warfare. The first reference to the military manual of the Damra Pichai Songkram is in 1518. And probably this was the heyday of the great military parade, which is described in the ceremonies of the 12 months for this era. A 2-day celebration of martial values, again featuring elephants very prominently, but also all kinds of fights. Luring elephants, bullock carriage fight, water buffalo fight, sheep fight, elephant fight, bald-headed people fight, chicken flapping, polo tossing. So, a great celebration of warfare and martial values. And this, too, is the time when martial literature, such as Yuan Pai, appears. These kinds of things only appear in times of warfare because they nurture martial values in the society and reduce the sensitivity about killing by making it seem normal, common, and by romanticizing the battlefield. But there were other impacts of this increase in warfare. The death toll certainly increased. The armies involved were massive. Even though figures given by European observers and local chroniclers may be very exaggerated, it's clear that Europeans thought that these armies were very large compared to what they saw in Europe at the same era. And the increased use of elephants, gunpowder, and mercenaries increased the death toll on the battlefield. Also, armies ranged farther afield, taking large numbers of people out of the area where they had immunity to the diseases. So there are huge numbers of reports of outbreaks of smallpox, fevers, and other diseases, and estimates on some campaigns that half the troops died, mostly from disease. On top of that, just moving these vast forces across the landscape left a trail of devastation, famine, and epidemic disease. At the approach of an army, villagers gathered up their daughters and their valuables and fled into the forest. Malaria was less a risk than these armies that were coming. So most likely, population declined over this age, and it was a horrible time to be alive. Okay. There's one other interesting part of Yuan Pai. Most of this poem is focused on the king and on the battle. This includes the eulogy of the king, the two versions of the historical background, the description of the army, the battle, and the victory. And all these sections are told by a narrator, and they feature no other human prominently except the king. Okay? They're very focused. But there's then one segment that is very, very different indeed. And this is about a man called Murndong Nakhon, who appears several times in the Chiang Mai Chronicles as a prominent soldier under King Tilok of Lanna. And Tilok put him in charge of Chiang Chön, what we now call Si Satchanalai, which was the strategic town which is the site of the battle in this poem. But after putting him in charge of Si Satchanalai, Tilok then fears that Dong has become too powerful and will revolt against him. So he sends a messenger to summon Dong to Chiang Mai, intending to kill him. And when the messenger delivers the summons, Dong understands straight away what it means, okay? And he replies with this speech. "Oh, sir, don't shilly..." Sorry, I've got behind on this. "Oh, sir, don't shilly with this Sam." In other words, don't waste time over this nonsense, right? "Speak straight. As urgent news has come, I must go there. And this accords with my intent as well. Whoe'er does right will ne'er come to grief. A subject of a king, an honest man, who dies because of loyalty unbent, though just a man in this world, in the next, will be on high with Indra, thronged with angels. A subject who the king supports, makes rich, who then does not maintain his loyalty, may live 1,000 years, yet like a corpse, and dead, descends into the seas of hell. I should not stay here thinking, but take leave, to pay respect to him of royal merit, the king of Chiang Mai, though he may lock me up and take my life. Let stories spread that I was true to him." Sure enough, on his arrival in Chiang Mai, Tilok has Dong killed immediately and his head impaled for public view. But when the news gets back to Si Satchanalai, his widow assembles the city folk and delivers this speech. "So many men, though good, are spun as bad. He, Dong, went on summons, though the charge was false. This no good king, Tilok, rewards good deeds with bad and casts aspersions. We must go elsewhere. This is not new. He bullied," he's talking about Tilok here, "his own father. He came to power by a coup against his father, the one to whom he should have been devout. He killed, beyond belief, his own sweet son. Before fearing that Dong would revolt, he feared his own son was revolt, and he killed him. He browbeats all his men and others too. This lord is truly dumb, an evil cur. Why should we suffer more beneath his sway? Our town should shift allegiance, serve that king, Trilokanath, depend upon his city, Ayutthaya, as they had been before." So this is a debate about loyalty to the king. Dong states that loyalty is an absolute virtue rewarded in heaven. His widow counters that loyalty is a contract, conditional on the good faith shown by the king, and voided if the king breaks this condition. This kind of debate can be found in the political theorizing of monarchies, absolute monarchies all around the world. Here, it is apparently lodged inside a poem which is ostensibly a glorification of a king. And on closer look, this story is littered with other examples of disloyalty. As we have just heard, Tilok rebelled against his own father, and he killed his own son. The whole fighting between Lana and Ayutthaya broke out because of disloyalty between Trilokanath and his cousin Uttisatiyan. And Chiang Chern, Sisatchanalai, is conquered twice because people inside open the gates to the enemies. The best way in this period to break a siege is to send money into the city to get people inside, to open the gates. Happens quite a lot. We can only speculate why and how this episode came to be in this poem. But it shows that Yuan Pai is not quite the simple royal eulogy and war poem that it might seem to be. And it shows that such debates on loyalty took place at that time, something we can only know from this work of literature. And for me, reading Yuan Pai was key to seeing how to write the history of Ayutthaya. The society that we can work out, starting from the hints in Yuan Pai, this society in which, which is very dehumanized, is very militarized, is evidently very different from the society of the Prasat Tong and King Narai eras, which are much more familiar to us because of the records of the Dutch and French and the studies by Niti Tirawat Bawan and others. To write the history of Ayutthaya needed a clear periodization, an age of warfare, followed by an age of peace and commerce, and arguments to explain what forces drove this dramatic transition. So, reading literature can be a key to how to write history. For the second part here, I'm going to move from early Ayutthaya to late Ayutthaya and talk about Kuncha and Kunpan. We know it was a very important piece of literature. It emerged from an oral tradition of recitation for local entertainment. It became hugely popular, and as a result, it became huge because the storytellers kept adding to it. It is unique. There is no other story from this era which has the same popularity. It's local, with no influence from outside the era. In some, it is quite simply a historical phenomenon which is worth studying in itself. And it also can tell us about late Ayutthaya in its own way. I'm going to talk a bit about the plot. So to begin with, let me just remind you by sketching a summary. Kunpan, Kunchang, and Wantong are childhood friends in Suphanburi. In teenage, they get entangled in a love triangle. And when Kunchang uses his wealth and court connections to get the upper hand, Kunpan flees to the forest with Wantong and is labeled as a rebel. When she becomes pregnant, they surrender and Kunpan is jailed. The son, Prawai, is then brought up by his grandmother. When he is grown, he secures his father's release and they lead a successful military expedition to Chiang Mai. Kunpan is then rehabilitated and made governor of Ganburi, Kanchanaburi, old Kanchanaburi. But when Kunpan, Prawai, and Kunchang get into a new quarrel, the king orders the execution of Wantong. This is the outline of the standard 1917 edition, the Chabap Hor Prasamut, edited under Prince Damrong. We began translating this in the early 2000s, and after a time, we realized that this 1917 edition was not the only Kunchan Kunpan, but rather was the end point of a long historical process. And we started burrowing backwards. We found that the What Got Press had published an edition in 1890, and Samuel Smith, another one, in 1872. And we could not find a copy of either of these in any library in Thailand. Think about it, it's amazing, really. And eventually, we found What Got in the library of the University of Michigan. And when we found it, I did a screenshot, so that's the screenshot. And eventually we found someone gave us a copy of half of Samuel Smith, but we've never seen the whole thing. And the two are basically very much the same. Where am I, right? And it appeared in the University of Michigan because the great scholar William Gedney had bought copies in the market in Sanam Luang and deposited them in his library. We learnt there was also a slightly earlier book containing passages written by Kru Jang, and again, none available in a library. Kun Wichit Matra had a copy, but his library burnt down. Kukrit had a copy, but he said he lost it. And we still haven't found. There's bits of it in the National Archives, originals, but we have never found the whole Kru Jang. Earlier than that, there are two fragments that have survived from before the Second Reign, and these were published by Gromsin. Even more fragmentary, there are references to the story in the Kamhaigan Chaukungao, the testimony taken down by the Ayutthaya prisoners taken to Burma in 1767. There's a summary of a Supanburi version by an abbot of Wat Palalai, and there's an undated but probably early version in Mon. This collection of sources is too fragmentary to write a solid history with any depth. But there is a fascinating and suggestive parallel. English historians have traced the story of Robin Hood. The name first appears in law court records in the 13th and 14th centuries. A Robin Hood, we don't know if there ever was a Robin Hood. It appears first as a name put together, a Robin Hood. It was a generic title for an outlaw. And by the 15th century, ballads appeared, songs, which celebrated Robin Hood as a rebel against king, church, and nobility. He was soon then merged with a green nature spirit and lord of misrule, Puck, basically, who appeared at festivals in midsummer. And in the 16th century, songs were written and performed locally, celebrating Robin Hood as a hero who stands for an alternative and natural force of lordship, who can destroy the agents of the world of legalism, of finance, and of regulation. In other words, a general bad boy. This got the elite, the authorities, so worried that they banned these plays. And in the 17th century, they started commissioning alternative versions of the story of Robin Hood in order to get this character and this story under control. They wrote plays in which Robin Hood was no longer a bandit, but a noble, fallen on bad times. And his enemy was not the king and the church, but a corrupt local official, the Sheriff of Nottingham. By the 19th century, this character had become a nationalist hero who righted wrongs and robbed the rich to give to the poor. And in the 20th century, boom, he appears as a children's tales, including the famous Disney character. So look what has happened to this character through history. He's zigzagging through history. The point is that such stories are political, and they are appropriated, modified, and manipulated by the political currents in society. And Kunshan Kunpen is exactly the same. And even with only our fragmentary record, we can see many changes in the story leading up to the 1917 edition, and I will talk about only a few. The first is the simplest and subtlest. In the older versions, Kungrai, the soldier father of Kunpen, is described as Kondi. And in the vocabulary of the time, this meant a person who was skilled at Sayasat, at Wetmon, at Yuyong Gongkapan. But in the 1917 edition, this was changed to become Pu Pakdi, a loyal person, meaning loyal to the king. Changing just one syllable has inverted the whole meaning of that phrase. And there's lots of very subtle editing like this. More broadly, there is a crucial modification to the character of Kunpen. In the older version, he's a soldier who only kills on the battlefield in his role. But in the 1917 edition, he kills 2 innocent northern peasants for a piece of magic, threatens to murder one wife, and butchers another, butchers Buakli, in order to make the Gumantong. And this is especially brutal. But this Buakli episode does not appear in earlier versions. It only appears in Kunshan Kunpen in the 1917 edition. More broadly still, there's a significant change in the portrayal of women. In the older versions, they can be very strong characters. In the scene where Kunpen and Wantong meet with him in the robe of a novice and her giving alms, she takes the lead in the exchange. She twinkles her eyes at him. She teases him by saying, "Don't you know that a novice is not supposed to talk while receiving alms? And are you being bothered by my beauty?" In the 1917 version, the roles are reversed. She is demure, and he starts the flirtation by saying, "But you haven't given me what I like." Similarly, in the scene where his son, Prawai, first meets his wife to be Simala, in the older version, we first listen to her thoughts and her description of him. They've just met, they've just seen one another for the safe time. They're sitting in a room with their parents present, and they're sort of eyeing one another like this. And we go into her thoughts, and she says, "Oh, he has a bright face and cheeks like nutmeg. His lips look as if painted with rouge. His black teeth gleam prettily. Hair as cute as a lotus pod. Eyebrows curved like a bow. The black pupils of his eye gleaming like jet. A strong chest and slim waist. Everything looks perfect. If he came to lie with me for one night, I'd gobble him up." So a very physical description, and then a burst of pure lust. In the 1917 edition, as soon as she sees him eyeing her, she's overcome with shyness and she runs out of the room. Talk about transforming a character. In sum, by the 1917 edition, the women have been rewritten to conform to a courtly ideal: demure, shy, innocent, quiet, submissive. But originally, they were strong and very forceful. More broadly still, there is a change in what we might call the social balance or the class balance of the whole story. The story of Kunpen's son, Prawai, is an addition to the original. It was probably an alternative version of the Kunpan story. It has exactly the same structure. And it was converted at some point into a sequel. The original story takes place almost wholly in Supan. The characters are ordinary local people. The narrative is wound around everyday events, births, deaths, marriages, crises. And the telling is very fast-paced, with a mix of romance, comedy, and tragedy. It's a bit like Star Wars. The sequel takes place almost wholly at the court in Ayutthaya or on military campaign. The other characters are courtiers, nobles, and soldiers. The narrative is wound around official life of audience, royal audience, law courts, and armies, and the pace is much slower. There is a sprinkling of court culture, particularly passages of didactic advice about being a good subject, a good noble, a good wife, a good son, the ones that you all learnt at school about Kunchang Kunpan. Within this sequel, the social status of Kunpan and his family has changed. Kunpan has become a provincial governor, his son is a royal page, his son has been gifted a royal wife, they have joined the 1%. Why the story was changed in these ways is not difficult to think, and it's not my concern today. Rather, I want to strip away these changes in order to see the story that became so popular and unique in Siam that it had to be got under control, just like Robin Hood. As noted, the early part, the original story, is mostly set in Supan, and it presents a panorama of local society. There are well-off families like Kunchang and Wantong's family, strugglers like Kunpan, Gao Giria, who's been sold into slavery by her father, and widows selling from stalls in the market, and so on. It's a real social panorama of local society. Describing this kind of panorama is itself a political act, an assertion of humanity. The king, then, is portrayed in almost cartoonish fashion, rather like the Queen of Hearts in Alice. Off with his head, remember? So when Kunpan's father makes a mistake in organizing a royal hunt, the king explodes, "Hey! Bring the executioners here immediately. I cannot keep him. Off with his head. Stick it up on a pole and raise it high. Steal his property and servants at once." And when Kunpan makes a mistake in the palace, he's condemned to execution. Skewer his head on a pole as an example to others. And Kunchang, don't leave him to pollute the earth. Cleave open his breast as an example to deter others. And also even the king of Chiang Mai. Don't spare this Chiang Mai rabble. Whenever they're found, slash them to dust. Lay waste their city and leave it deserted. And a lady who's found guilty of love magic, Paya Yomarat, take her away and slash her dead. Open her chest with an axe for public shame. There's also some more subtle mockery. In the episode where Kunpan's father dies, the army that goes out is described as every bit as grand as the armies that appear in the chronicles and appear in Yuan Pai. But what's it being taken out for? It's being taken out to hunt buffaloes. Right? Then, when the king wants to send an army north to attack Chiang Mai, nobody volunteers to lead it. The nobles are all too cowardly, and the king is powerless to order them. He's reduced to sending Kunpan, who's about 16 years old at this point. In the repeat of this story in the sequel, Wai rejects the king's offer to conscript an army as it will be, quote, troublesome for the people. And instead, he asks for the release of 35 criminals from the jail. At the roll call, they present themselves as threats to Buddhism, tax collection, merchant wealth, and the administrative frame. On the march north, they get smashed on liquor, ganja, and gatom. And of course, they win a victory. The story also mocks the official nobility through words spoken by the king. Ah, you're all chatter and no substance. You're good only at cheating your own men out of money by using your clever tongues. I don't have to support you with allowances. Your property and rank are a burden on the realm. By contrast, Kun Pen is portrayed as a figure of power who can offer protection to the people similar to a king. And his powers come from his education, his knowledge of law, which is passed on via monks and family, and is not dependent on royal grant or official title. And as this original story approaches its climax, Kun Pen is introduced with invocations like a ruler, as Kun Pen whose powers were unmatched, or Kun Pen whose powers were famous everywhere. And when he has a special sword forged, he exclaims, "This sky storm is superb. Tens and hundreds of thousands of other swords are not as good. Even the king's regal sword is not equal to mine." There are then 4 scenes which raise the question whether Kun Pen's powers can override those of the king. By the 1917 edition, all 4 have been changed to show that there is no chance. The king is always superior. But in the older versions, in 2 places, Kun Pen succeeds. In this one, the king is going to condemn him for something, and he blows a mantra, and the king calms down. And in the other 2, Kun Pen explains that he chose not to use his powers, and his old teachers express amazement that he did not use his powers when they surely would have been effective. Kun Pen is portrayed as the ordinary man struggling against wealth and power, the wealth of Kun Chang and the power of the king. Kun Pen burst out against Kun Chang. "You think I deserve to be cut to pieces like this just because I'm poor?" And there's several of these kind of references, many of which are cut by 1970. In the original story, without the Pratwai sequel, the execution of Wantong comes immediately after the return from the forest. It's clearly a punishment for rebellion, for revolt, not for Wantong's failure to choose between 2 men. So if we strip back to the original story, it's a panorama of local society with an ordinary man as hero and strong women. And the powers of Kun Pen are a signal of hope, of a possibility of a fairer society, a better life. But the execution of Wantong is a cold reminder of the real power of the king and the consequences of crossing him. This original story is a social product generated by the interplay between storytellers and their audiences, and thus reflecting the ideas and sentiments of their time. It's an assertion of the importance of humanity and the universality of humanity. It's a blow against the dehumanization of the kind we saw in Yuan Pai. In Europe, similar sentiments were the driving force behind the emergence of popular drama in the 17th century and the panoramic novels in the 18th and 19th, Trollope, Turgenev, Balzac, Zola, and so on. They are counter to the dehumanization. Kun Chang, Kun Pen and its themes seem to be unique in Siam at the time. As we say, there's no other stories, though there are echoes in the local non-canonical Jataka tales that might date to this era. But there are also very interesting echoes in another medium, which is in the murals which appeared on the Wats around this time. There are around a dozen which have murals that probably date to the Ayutthaya era, before 1767, probably to the 18th century. They are in small wat in provincial towns, and they would have been sponsored and painted by local people. Almost all of their murals include scenes of everyday life inserted alongside the episodes from the life of the Buddha or from the Jataka tales. At Wat Kian in Angtong, the dividers in the wall contain scenes of people at work or people traveling through the countryside. At Wat Konkaram in Ratburi, a frieze running below episodes from the life of the Buddha portrays ordinary people doing all kinds of things, chatting, buying noodles, crafting a boat, prisoners in chains, children playing. And at Wihan Klep in Ratburi, there's some very strange kind of meeting going on, which appears inside scenes of the life of the Buddha. And at Wat Chong Non Si, just down here in Bangkok, scenes are squeezed into corners between Jataka tales, including these mahout on elephants waiting for a ride, just like motorcycle drivers at the Bak Soi today. Perhaps these scenes are a way to bring the story of the Buddha closer, not 2,000 years ago and 2,000 kilometers away, but here today in Siam. At Wat Chayatit in Thonburi, immediately outside the tent where Queen Mahamaya is giving birth to the Buddha, there is a scene down here, a scene of a family picnic. On the left, there's a man courting a girl here with a flower. Then there's a lady here who's suckling a child. And there's Granny over here doing some cooking. The scene from the life of the Buddha are painted in traditional court style, very elaborate up here. And these are painted in a much more naturalistic story, but they're only a couple of centimeters apart. Similarly, at Wat Padu outside Ayutthaya, the entertainment at the cremation of the Buddha are watched by a typically cosmopolitan Siamese crowd with Thai, Chinese, Kek, Mon, and others. Like the original story of Kunchan Kunpen, these paintings are intent on portraying ordinary people and everyday life, a panorama of society. And at Wat Got in Petbury, there is a small panel where this panorama is very clear. It's just this panel here, this is not the famous bit of Wat Got, it's just this panel above the door here. And it looks like this, okay? At the top here, there's a king in a palace, and he's being attended over here by his nobles, and he has attended also by the royal women over here. On the other side, there's another king. Maybe it's a second king. It's not very clear. And he again, he's attended on by nobles, and he has a Mahori orchestra here. In between them here, there's a waterway of some kind. And we have here, you can see there's royal barges with, Supanahong, like. And it's a beautiful garden with all kind of greenery and fruits. And then along the middle of this story, there's a wall. And this wall is very clearly modeled on the wall of Ayutthaya. But it also, in this poem, it's a wall between royalty, and the rest of society. So over here, outside the walls, what we first see is a noble, a man of power. This is a gesture that means he is giving an order. He's being carried on a palanquin, and behind him come his retinue carrying his regalia. In front of them, there's a market. We know there were markets outside the walls in Ayutthaya. Here, there's a lady vendor selling something. Here, a man is getting some kind of massage. Here, people are pouring out of the town to do their shopping. And here's someone selling liquor. And further on here, we see soldiers coming out of a gate, soldiers riding on elephants. And next to them, a Persian riding a very pretty piebald pony with bald, and he has no shoes. He's bald feet. In front down here, there's the river, the river running round Ayutthaya. And over on this side, people are washing the king's elephants. Here's the trunks, okay? They're washing the king's elephant. In the middle here, there's a lady selling guitiao, and she's got a lovely little hat here to protect her from the sun. And further over here, we see another noble. He's in a reganya. He's in a canopy boat, which only nobles can have, and he has a pretty girl sitting at the back of his boat. Ajahn Pichaya, whose photo this is, thinks this panel portrays the Mahanakorn in the Draipum geography, and he's probably right. But it also portrays Ayutthaya, its social spectrum and its political hierarchy. The appearance of ordinary people and a social panorama was very different from what you'd seen in earlier manuscript painting. And this was not only because there was more space available on the walls, it also reflected popular thinking. And let me again make a comparison with Europe. Up to the Renaissance, painting portrayed only religious scenes or royalty. But then artists found a way to include ordinary people by having them watching a religious scene in the middle. But then in the mid-15th century, they began to portray a broader elite. These are some rich nobles out shopping. And by the mid-16th, they were painting the common man and woman at work and play. And behind these changes was a new conception of the relationship between man and God and between man and king. These murals are telling the same message as Kunchang Kunpen, but in a different language. They are asserting the dignity and universality of humanity. Literature and painting can take us below the level of the elites and give a fuller picture of humanity making history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have quite a bit of time for questions and discussion. Actually, I would like to take the opportunity first. It just struck me that the official version of Kunchang Kunpan came out in 1917. That's towards the end of the First World War, actually. And with my background in Chinese history, that is right around the time of the New Culture movement in China, which would later bring about the May 4th movement in 1919 and eventually result in the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. The reason why I was thinking about this was that in my training, the first instance in the history of Chinese literature in which you have women objectifying men as sexual objects in literature is Miss Sophia's Diaries, first published in 1927 as a kind of a product of the May 4th era. And I have always been trying to look around for, Thai literature of comparable period in which you have women sexualizing men instead of the other way around. I mean, men are always sexualizing women in literature, right? And I haven't come across Thai literature in comparable period that do that. But we see this as the older versions of Kunchang Kunpan very clearly, something that's from the earlier 19th century and even from the 18th century. We already see that. And that kind of, and your comparison with Robin Hood in the English tradition, then it reminded me that in the Chinese case, after you have the May 4th movement, the New Culture movement, the May 4th movement, and the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, you have the re-emergence of these martial art literature, which becomes kind of like literature of the people and, supporting revolution and all that. So it's very interesting that actually we have this tradition even long before the modern era. And so it's kind of this like upside down different ways of development in the Thai case, in the English case, and compared to the Chinese communists. So yes, that's just me.
Can I
yes, please.
just react to that slightly? I think that's very interesting. If you also, there's not very much of Thai literature, sort of popular Thai literature outside Kunchang Kunpan, except, I suspect, some of the Jataka stories, particularly in the Banyat Jadok, the Jataka stories which were composed here. They were composed in Siam, or at least in Southeast Asia. And it's impossible, it seems impossible to date them. But there are about 10 stories towards the end of the Thai collection of the Banyat Chadok, which have extraordinary female characters. They have one story in which the Bodhisattva and his wife get split up. In order to get back together, she takes an oath and becomes a man, and actually becomes the Shankara of a city. And then only when she again meets back the Bodhisattva again, she converts back into a woman. And another one in which this woman becomes a leader of an army. She collects an army, she defeats men in elephant duels, and all kinds of other things. Extraordinary women in these stories.
Yes, who could have thought that religious lore would be so revolutionary, right? So please, I'm sure we have lots of questions, comments. I will be running around with a microphone, so if anyone raise your hand, let me know. Don't be shy. Yes.
No, die.
หมายถึงอาจารย์ทำให้ยวนพ่ายเนี่ยมันน่าสนใจในความหมายที่มันทำให้เห็นถึงความรุนแรงผมไม่กล้าพูดแต่ว่าหมายถึงว่าอาจารย์คิดว่าในงานที่คนไทยนักวิชาการไทยเนี่ยที่ศึกษายวนพ่ายเคยพูดถึงแอสเปกนี้ไหมถ้าไม่ผมอยากรู้ว่าในความเห็นของอาจารย์ทำไมคนไทยถึงไม่เห็นความรุนแรงที่มันกราฟิกขนาดนั้นในวรรณกรรมที่ศึกษากันจำนวนมากนั่นคือข้อที่หนึ่งที่ผมอยากถามข้อที่สองเนี่ยเมื่อกี้อาจารย์พยายามจะเชื่อมโยงความเป็นสมัยใหม่ของยุโรปกับการนำเสนอ common life ordinary life ในคุณช้างคุณแผนอาจารย์กำลังขยับพีเรียดที่อาจารย์นิธิพยายามเสนอขึ้นไปอยู่ตรงปลายอยุธยาหรือว่าจะต้องการจะเสนออะไรขอบคุณครับ
Yes, the first one, I mean, I really can't comment on why Thai scholars have not burrowed into these aspects of Yuan Pai in the same way. And perhaps it's just that the, if you like, the culture of literary scholarship here does not point them in that direction. But to me, it was reading it and translating it. It was such a powerful story. I mean, it's so powerfully written and it's so graphic and so on. that I sort of couldn't help bringing out these aspects of the story. But I'm reluctant to conclude anything about Thai literary scholarship from that. I first got interested in Kunchang Kumpen from the project of translating Bakkai Bai Re. Okay, so I went from that into it. But just as, Saichon has found that you can push a lot of Niti's findings back into late Ayutthaya, I think that becomes very clear. And Niti never really thought about this history of the history of Kunchang Kumpen in the way that we had. And it was very much just getting that copy of the What Got publication from Michigan and starting to compare line by line to see, how it had been changed, both in the textual editing and the change in the certain scenes which do not appear. It became clear how much this story had changed, even just in those 40 years, you see. So you can imagine going further back. It would be very interesting. There is clearly a version in Supan somewhere, because one of the old abbots of Wat Palalai wrote a sort of summary of it in one of the books about Wat Palalai. But we couldn't find it. We spent some time asking around in Supan to see if I bet someone does have it. And the other very interesting one is that there's two versions in Mon. And I have not been able to get anyone to translate them. I've only got translated the chapter headings. Right? And they are very interesting because they're clearly the original story. They don't have the Prawai sequel in there. They're much shorter. In fact, the whole story from the love triangles through the Kumpang going off to war through to the execution in the original probably takes place over very few months. Just maybe half a year or something like that.
Thank you, Ajahn Chris, for the talk, and it's really fun. Lately there was like a movement in the Western that they're saying that, not just history but economics and politics. Well, it's all related, but still, they're saying that our interpretation of justice and of the direction of our society, related back to, the story of ideological crash. We try to form a narrative, the history of, the literature and the history, and we try to think that this is the way of, what it should be. This is what you're trying to tell us too, right? But in the Thai context.
I'm not sure I understand. I don't.
I'm sorry. Lately there was a movement like David Graeber and the Dawn of Everything. Have you heard of the Dawn of Everything? They're saying that history of the humanity is not exactly linear.
Yeah.
It's not like moving from agriculture to commerce and so on and so forth. Yeah, but it becomes like we try to formulate a story telling that there's one way of a straightforward way to go, but for in reality it's not like that. It comes back and forth all the time. And what you're showing us in Kunchang Kunpan versions, you're trying to say that, well, there are ideological clash in each version. Is that so? Can you comment?
Yeah, yes. I think if you step back from the details of what I'm saying today, is, there are any number of different ways to write history. And the choice of what kind of history you write is a political act, okay? And some historians are not so conscious of that or explicit about that. But to me, it's rather important to think about what you are doing and why you are doing it. And in a sense, I've been in a rather unusual situation in having parachuted into Thailand and deciding to continue studying the history because I enjoy it, but not having the structure of being in a university or any particular school or anything like that, which gives me a certain privilege, if you like, to take some risks and to sort of go sideways and so on, which I've had great fun doing, yes.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Thank you for the interesting lecture, Ajahn Chris. My name is Lily. I'd like to ask you two questions about elephants. One short and one long question. So the short one is, if we go back to your slide on the words of a war elephant, and the Thai text say, ช้างฆ่าควรเมือง but in your translation you said an elephant whose value is surpassing the value of the city. So I wonder why you choose to use the word surpass instead of equals to the city's value.
Well,
That is
okay,
a short one.
Yes,
And the long one,
Yeah.
you have shown us how much importance elephants are in this text. And I wonder, I'm actually curious, what's your take on the comparison between the significance of the elephant lives and humans' life in this text? What is your impression on that? Thank you very much.
In the translation, it was partly because I am trying to reflect the alliteration in there, ka kuan mung, so city surpass worth, I'm trying to get the sound in there as well, okay? Yes, yeah. If you read this whole section going through this elephant, 60 of them, one after another like this, with these fancy names and so on, it's really over the top, and then when you see that in the context that the poem gives absolutely no praise or worth to a human characters outside the Mun Dong Nakorn episode. They just, it even says at one point, even though there are many officers in this army, they don't matter because all the orders come from the king. It says it straight out. So everyone is just, their worth is dissipated like that. I think this is very instructive to take this, to say why, what is behind this kind of presentation of things. You can say that it's simply necessary in order to make the praise of the king so powerful that you do not have anything comparable in there. Yes, but that that in a way is saying the same thing, isn't it? Yeah.
I was wondering about this as well, the issue of the elephants. I wonder if it's because elephants are kind of seen as tanks or rockets, or I mean, you think about how modern military is presented. You know, they show off tanks, they show off technology, and maybe like elephants are seen more as that rather than living being. Ajahn Pawan has comments.
May I just add in here? This is not my own answer, but I would just say that one of our former MA students is now doing PhD at Leiden University, and he is working on the emblematic meaning of elephants. Well, I suppose that next year he will graduate, so we will have an opportunity to read this work. So if I try to connect this to your question, the values of elephants in Yuan Pai text may be rather emblematic. So, you know, the hidden power behind the royalty or kingship. So that's why it was highly valued in this text. That's all.
But they enormously increase the power of the army, you know, and the fact they start hunting, seriously hunting. Why you find so many white elephants are found in this period, famously, is simply because they were hunting many more, and they were catching many more, and therefore, by statistical probability, they found more white elephants as well. And there's this short period where elephants make this huge difference to warfare. And the point about my star, you know, showing them going to attack Lana, you know, it took you, if you were walking, it takes you half a year to get there, and you can't carry anything very much. You know, so it makes an enormous difference too. But it's only a quite short window, because once gunpowder comes, elephants' effectiveness is diminished. Not totally wiped out, but it's diminished, because many of them are frightened by explosions. So they become very difficult to control on the battlefield. You lob a few, you know, explosions at them, and they tend to run away. So it's this period from, you know, about 1400 to about 1550. By then you've got a lot of gunpowder technology around, and they start to be less important. And then they get romanticized in the elephant duel.
Yes. Please wait for the microphone.
I want to ask about how the comparison between Robin Hood and Khun Chang Khun Pan in terms of political narrative shift or development. Robin Hood นะคะจากที่เห็นก็มันมีการดำเนินเรื่องแบบคนเอารอก่อนแล้วค่อยๆ develop มาเป็นคนที่ทำเพื่อชาติคนที่ทำเพื่อส่วนรวมคนที่ทำเพื่อคนที่ด้อยกว่าแล้วมันกลายเป็นมีชื่อเสียงโดดเด่นในแง่ของวรรณกรรมเด็กด้วยค่ะเราว่ามันเป็นพลังที่น่ากลัวมากคือจากเรื่องเล่าประวัติศาสตร์ที่มีนัยยะทางการเมืองแล้วกลายเป็นเรื่องเล่าของเด็กได้วรรณกรรมเด็กได้เปรียบเทียบกับขุนแผนนะคะมันมีนัยยะคือออริจินอลลี่มันอาจจะเริ่มต้นเป็นแค่ความบันเทิงเป็นแค่สื่อบันเทิงของกลุ่มคนกลุ่มหนึ่งจากเรื่องเล่าชาวบ้านใช่ไหมคะแต่ว่าวิธีการ develop เนื้อเรื่องให้เข้าสู่สื่อกระแสหลักมันเป็นลักษณะของแบบเกือบจะเป็นการ์ตูนขำขันแล้วการ์ตูนแบบติดโปด้วยซ้ำอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะทั้งที่จริงๆแล้วอย่างที่อาจารย์บอกว่ามันมีนัยยะของ signal of hope ด้านคน local จะสามารถเติบโตมียศถาบรรดาศักดิ์ได้แบบเหมือนเป็นความหวังให้กับคนชาวบ้านที่แบบสามารถถ้าทำเพื่อชาติก็สามารถเติบโตได้แต่ว่าเราอยากถามความเปรียบเทียบอยากถามแง่การเปรียบเทียบความต่างหรือความเหมือนของโรบินฮูดกับขุนช้างขุนแผนนะคะอย่างที่เราสังเกตเรามองว่า คุณช้างคุณแผนที่ยังไปไม่ได้ถึงระดับเมนสตรีมเรื่องเล่าของเมนสตรีมในฐานะฮีโร่เพราะว่านอกจากเรื่องของพฤติกรรมส่วนตัวที่ดูเจ้าชู้ดูไม่น่าเชื่อถืออะไรด้วยมันเหมือนมีความพยายามบอกไกลๆไหมคะว่าต่อให้เป็นคนบ้านๆเข้ามารับใช้ชาติท่าไหนแต่ว่าอยู่จะไม่มีทางได้มีอำนาจเหนือสถาบันนะคะเหนือกษัตริย์ที่สุดท้ายแล้วแม้ว่าตั้งแต่ต้นเรื่องระหว่างเรื่องของพ่อขุนแผนหรือแม้กระทั่งตอนจบของขุนแผนที่เมียถูกตัดสินประหารชีวิตมันผ่านอำนาจของกษัตริย์หมดเลยอะค่ะเราก็เลยไม่เลยคิดว่านอกจากเรื่องของเรื่องเล่าที่มันดูเน้นเอนเตอร์เทนเมนต์แล้วด้วยอีกส่วนหนึ่งที่ทำให้เรื่องนี้มันไม่สามารถไปแบบโรบินฮูดได้เป็นเพราะว่าการพยายามบอกตรงนี้หรือเปล่าว่าต่อให้ไพร่พยายามทำเพื่อชาติขนาดอยู่ก็ต้องเป็นไพ่อยู่ล่ำไปประมาณนี้อยากถามในเชิงมุมของอาจารย์นะคะ
Yeah, I mean, you can't take the comparison too far because the database that on the two sides are very different. There is no Stephen Knight, who wrote most of those things. He is the professor, or was, of Robin Hood studies. Right? Think about that. We don't have a professor of Kunpan studies in Thailand, do we? It's a long way away. And that's because the amount of literature that exists through history, through these plays and these the plays and songs and records, all kinds of stuff, is enormous amount. You see, it's a huge amount of literature that he has been able to study to give this very detailed story. And there's nothing, in a sense, what we have on Kunchang Kumpen is much less. We only have, these relatively good couple of versions which come from 40 years earlier and which before the editing, not all of it. You see, I mean, we know that there's at least two stages of editing. There's an editing in the second reign, and Sun Thorn Poo coming in there. And then there's another editing with Prince Damrong. So, and there's, in a sense, also the editing by Kukrit. Because far more people have read Kukrit's book on Kunchang Kumpen than have read Kunchang Kumpen. And Kukrit is an extremely, because he's such a good and entertaining writer, we had, when we were translating this, we would talk to people about Kunchang Kumpen, and we would type, and they would always come back to us, and you could tell after 5 minutes or so that they knew all they'd read was Kukrit. So they were giving you Kukrit on Kunchang Kumpen, which is very distorted, and he has no conception of the history. So there has been this management of the story, first in the second reign, then by Prince Damrong, and then, in a sense, by Kukrit as well. And we can only sort of burrow back. We cannot get a very clear picture of what the story was earlier. And so I'm sort of doing a trick of the light here by saying, if you strip away the bits we know were added in later, what do we get? Okay? But it is, I mean, it's a little tricky to do that, and we're not on very solid ground once you've gone back into doing that. But what you can see or hinted at is, I mean, as I can hear you may say that Kunpan is a rather violent character and Jiao Chu and all this sort of stuff. He probably wasn't in the original, but the court, they had to damn this guy. That's like Robin Hood was so dangerous, you had to turn him into a Disney character in the end. I think Kunpan was originally a very powerful and seen by the elite as a very dangerous character, and they needed to get this story under control. But what the story was at this earlier time, we can only sort of try to reconstruct. We don't have it. I think I would love to see the Mon version translated, because I think that could be very interesting. I think it's very old. Yeah. And there are some other manuscripts in the National Archives, which are also quite old. And we've looked at some of them, but we decided that if we sort of spent our time in there, we would never finish the project. So
my question concerns the comparison also. I'd like to know the basis of your thoughts when you come to conclude that the period in which Kun Chang Kun Pan was published, was written, is the Thai early modern period in the sense of European modern period. I mean, by saying that, you're like suggesting that it's the same phenomenon, and I'd like to know how you justify your arguments. Is it enough to like identify the similar traits into periods, or what are your justifications?
yeah, all I'm saying, it's a good question. But all I'm saying is, the trouble very often with Thai literary studies, it's got blinkers like that, and it doesn't look at anything over here. And only if you look at something like Robin Hood, can you imagine what could have happened to this story? So to me, it's a business of just opening out your perspective and then saying, well, what if we follow this line of thinking? That's all. And we're not being deterministic about this. We're not saying this has to follow the route of Europe or anything like that. Just saying that if you take comparisons to other cultures, it sometimes gives you an insight. That's all. When we were translating Tawatotsama, 12 months, in the middle of doing that, we began to get the impression that it was very like an elegy. It was very like the European poems of remembrance of someone who has passed away. And then when we started to look at it, it was extraordinarily similar, the amount of things that are comparable and have clearly not happened at all because of influence, foreign costs, because there was no influence from Europe at the time Tawatotsama is composed. Just simply that humans in different societies react to death in a similar way. And so when that reaction to death is translated into a poem, it has amazing similarities between the European ones and Asian ones, and Japanese. There's also Japanese.
I was thinking that this is almost, in a way, the manipulation of the publication of Kun Chang Kun Pan from the 1917 version to Kukrit's version. In a way, it's almost like a manipulation of historiography, almost, because, I don't know how many times I've come across writings in Thai history that when they want to present that something is folk Thai, and then they prove that this is folk Thai by saying that it's in Kun Chang Kun Pan. And Kun Chang Kun Pan is like taken for granted that this is folk Thai. And then no one asks beyond that. And it's very interesting to see that this standard of folk Thai has gone through so many versions and has been manipulated very clearly to suit the political structure of the day. So yeah, I think it also raises a huge question in the way we understand Thai history, or the way we narrate Thai history as what is folk and what is not. And I was also thinking of this idea of, I mean, I'm not into gender history, but people who might do, history of feminism or gender history or the gender aspect of all these things. And Kun Chang Kun Pan has so often been like brought up to say, you see, folk Thai is like this, right? And you see, especially the gender relation issues in Kun Chang Kun Pan has been manipulated so much that maybe we need to raise a question mark next time someone says, well, it's in Kun Chang Kun Pan. We say, which Kun Chang Kun Pan? It is. And if we can ever raise fund to have a chair professor of Kun Chang Kun Pan, I think Ajahn Chris would definitely be the first one. So, yeah, we have many people from the literature department's translation studies. We can work on that. Yes, please, Ajahn Praya.
สวัสดีค่ะอาจารย์คริส This is not a question but rather my observation after hearing your talk for so many times. When Kun Chang Kun Pan was first released, I mean the English version, I remember you said nobody read poetry anymore, so we translated in prose and blah blah blah. At that time I didn't have much time to decipher all things, but after and I think you have translated several books already, and I think it's quite timely to ask this, maybe share this kind of thought. For Yuan Pai, I think Yuan Pai is not very widely read by Thais and hardly appear in any literature course, either in the secondary level or university level. And so I hardly had any memory about it. And but what I remember was that when you read this kind of stuff, and the focus is paid on the words, the beauty of it. Like Yuan Pai contains several words from foreign languages like the Khmer, Pali, Sanskrit, and so on. But when I actually bought the book, but I saw the slide, and when I saw the English version, and it just reminded me that all those ancient words don't really matter. All that I can actually see is the very vivid portrayal of the fight, and which is Ajahn Thanapon just described as the violence of it all, which may not be covered that much by maybe literature professor and so on. So do you think that this kind of apply to your translation? I mean, after translating like 1,000 pages, the focus might not be on all these rhymes, beautiful words anymore, but the imagery, the portrayal of the scenes, and so on. And when I read your Kun Chang Kun Pan, I found it even more straightforward. I think the Thai is already straightforward in the sense that it doesn't hide all the violence, but still it can be toned down by, the violence may be hidden under all those literary devices, all those beautiful words. But in English, I think what I can get is that the focus is primarily on the image of it. I think the words that you pick are more action-oriented, so it's kind of give you that very vivid movement of the scenes. So it's very different from reading the Thai original, and that's what I observed so far. And I think the reader of the English version might have that, might sense that as well, because Thai students are kind of trained to focus on all the rhyme scheme and so on. But when it's become translated, it is aimed at a new set of audience. It becomes world literature. So I think in English, the focus has shifted quite significantly, and I maybe after having translated so many pages already, Have you ever wondered about how the audience in English would receive your work? I mean, all the Thai literary pieces that you have translated.
Every translation is bound to change the text. You cannot reproduce a text from one language to another without changing it in certain ways. And anyone doing translation has to be aware of that. The difficulty, and I mean, we have now done all, 5 of the early works, the ones that come from around 1500. And the point with these is that a Thai nowadays cannot read these straight, right? It's like an English person trying to read Anglo-Saxon. The language has changed so much that you can't just, an ordinary person cannot pick up this book and read it in the Thai from 500 years ago, because it doesn't make sense anymore, okay? So it's a question of, what actually you are comparing to here when you say, when I read it, it's different. Well, you can't read it. You are having to do an act of translation in order to read it today in Thai, okay? So both are acts of translation of one sort or another. I think I'm very interested by your suggestion of a sort of trend in the way that it goes. And here is the most interesting is on okay, yes. The way that Pasuk and I have always approached the translation is that we make sure that we kind of understand the words in the line perfectly, so as well as we can. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes, Prasert or whoever we're relying on is saying, well, actually, I'm not that sure myself. So you get to, you got to an idea of what it says. Then there's what we have always tried to do, which many translators do not do, is then to try and reflect something of the craft of the original in the translation, okay? So you want to get some of the lyricism, some of the alliteration, some of the rhythm, some of the sound in the English translation reflecting the Thai. So we will read the two together, okay, of each line to try and get something more than just the bald meaning of the words, okay? So, and it's interesting that there are now 4 translations of Lilit Pralor. Okay, well, actually, there's more than that. There's a couple of older ones, but they're not very good. So Robert Bickner did his translation back in the 1970s and 1980s, and now has published. And we have done ours. There's a French translation and a Chinese translation. And Emily Testard from Paris has just written quite an interesting comparison of the 3, not the Chinese, but the other 3, which will be published in the Journal of the Siam Society later this year. And it's very interesting in the way she said, she pulls out, how different the emphases are in these 3 different versions. And that's not surprising. And in fact, one of the reasons that Pasuk and I decided to do Pralor is because we had read Bickner, and we didn't particularly like it, So we thought, no, actually, the poem is much, it's much livelier than his translation. So we want to do it again. So.
Oh, yes.
Apart from Khun Chang Khun Pan, are there any Thai folks that are historical literature in Ajahn Chris' opinion?
Historical literature, meaning
what?
Literature which has a history.
Yes,
that's right. Not that we know of, okay? Except that is to some extent in the Jataka tales. The Jataka tales, because several of the tales in Banyachadok came from folk literature, okay, and were converted into a chadok, okay? So you can sort of see that transition. But apart from that, nothing that I know, nothing I know.
Okay, we can take one more question. Yes.
I don't know, when you mentioned at the beginning that your subject of talk today is the last one is humanity or humanities?
T.
T.
Why?
Okay, why? Okay, yeah, that's it.
Maybe you can clarify that question?
No,
I'm
it's question
confused by the question.
Actually, you mentioned a lot of humanity in this talk.
Yeah.
Actually, when I first heard it, I thought that IES, so I expect that you might mention something about humanities as a whole. So I'm waiting for that, and then I just realized that maybe what you mentioned is humanities. Yeah, but if you can give a few words on humanities, that may be great.
No, Ajahn Chris would like to stay clear of humanities.
No, it's a big subject, not for today.
Okay, I think we have, Ajahn Chris has worked very hard for us this afternoon, and we have had quite a lively discussion here. So before we end this, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Pasuri Lusakun, the Deputy Dean of International Affairs, to present Ajahn Chris with flowers. As มาตรงกลางก็ได้ค่ะได้ถ่ายรูปค่ะ Our appreciation. Not only the history department, but the whole Faculty of Arts, we are very honored to be able to claim Ajahn Chris as our honorary doctorate. And yes, thank you so very much again. So, yes, we are finished. Thank you very much.